On the morning of July 15, 1099, the air inside the ancient city of Jerusalem was thick, not with the scent of prayer or incense, but with the suffocating smell of iron, sweat, and rotting flesh. A handful of knights, their eyes bloodshot from years of exhaustion and their bodies skeletal from famine, finally breached the northern walls. They had marched over 3,000 miles across treacherous mountains and scorching deserts. They'd eaten their own horses, buried their brothers in foreign soil, and some had even resorted to the unthinkable act of cannibalism just to stay alive. It was one of the most thoroughly documented and brutal massacres in the history of the medieval world. For 2 days, the streets of Jerusalem ran with blood so deep that chroniclers claimed it reached the knees of their horses. Muslims, Jews, and even Eastern Christians were cut down without mercy. The victors eventually walked to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, knelt among the dead, and wept with joy. They sincerely believed they had done God's work. But why does the history we are taught often hide the grime, the greed, and the terrifying psychological darkness behind this holy mission? To understand the darkness of the First Crusade, we have to look past the myth of the noble knight in shining armor. The popular image of a chivalrous protector of the faith is a later invention of Romantic literature. In reality, the 11th century Western Europe was a violent, fractured, and economically stagnant backwater. It was a land of small men with big swords. The feudal system had produced an entire class of professional warriors known as the Younger Sons. Because of the law of primogeniture, where only the eldest son inherited the father's land, thousands of trained killers were left with no land, no income, and nothing to do but fight. These knights spent their days raiding local villages, stealing from helpless peasants, and fighting each other in endless petty blood feuds. The church was losing its grip on society, facing a rival pope in Rome and a continent drowning in its own internal violence. When a letter arrived from the Byzantine Emperor Alexios in the east asking for a few thousand mercenaries to help fight the rising Seljuk Turks, Urban saw a political masterstroke. He didn't just want to help the East. He wanted to export Europe's most dangerous men to a place where they would become someone else's problem. At the Council of Clermont in 1095, Urban II delivered a speech that would change the course of human history forever. He didn't speak about military strategy or helping an ally. He spoke about fire, blood, and the desecration of holy sites. He painted a picture of infidels committing unspeakable acts against pilgrims. But the real dark truth was his revolutionary offer: the plenary indulgence. He told this crowd of murderers and thieves that if they took up the cross and marched to Jerusalem, every sin they had ever committed, past, present, and even future, would be instantly wiped clean. For men who lived in genuine, daily terror of hellfire and eternal damnation, this was a golden ticket. It was a get-out-of-hell free card that turned killing into a form of penance. For a knight who had spent his life raping and pillaging in France or Germany, the crusade wasn't just a war. It was a way to arrive in heaven with a clean soul while still doing what he did best: cutting throats. This spiritual bribe created a fanatical energy that was both unstoppable and completely ungovernable. But here's the first major rehook of this story. The first victims of this march for Christ were not the Seljuk Turks or the Fatimids in the Middle East. They were Jewish families living peacefully in the heart of Europe. Before the great lords could even organize their professional armies, a people's crusade erupted. Led by a charismatic barefoot monk known as Peter the Hermit, tens of thousands of ordinary peasants, beggars, and minor knights set off. They were unorganized, hungry, and fueled by a dark logic. Why travel thousands of miles to fight the enemies of God in Jerusalem when the enemies of God are living right here in our own streets? This led to the first great genocide of the Crusade. In cities like Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, these holy pilgrims turned into a lynch mob. They broke into Jewish homes and synagogues, giving people a choice: convert to Christianity on the spot or be slaughtered. Thousands of Jewish men and women chose death over forced baptism. This was not a tactical necessity of war. It was a religiously fueled robbery and massacre. The Crusaders stole the wealth of these communities to fund their journey, proving that from day one, the mission was as much about plunder as it was about prayer. By the time the professional army of knights finally reached the legendary city of Antioch in 1097, any remaining sense of heroism had been replaced by a primal struggle for survival. The siege of Antioch lasted for 8 grueling months, and the conditions outside the walls were a descent into total madness. The Crusaders were trapped between the massive walls of the city and a relief army of Turks coming to wipe them out. They ran out of food within weeks. They ate their horses, then their pack animals, then their dogs. One of the most horrifying chapters in Crusader history occurred at a town called Mara. After a long siege, the Crusaders finally broke through the defenses. They were so delirious with hunger that they began to cook and eat the flesh of the fallen enemy soldiers. This wasn't a rumor spread by their enemies. Their own chroniclers, like Fulcher of Chartres, recorded the events with a chilling matter-of-fact tone. One account stated that they cut the flesh of the dead into slices and cooked it over fires. This act of cannibalism was a psychological breaking point. To the local Muslim and Eastern Christian populations, the Franks were no longer just invaders. They were literal monsters who ate human beings. This reputation of the cannibal crusader became a trauma that stayed in the collective memory of the Middle East for nearly 1,000 years. The survival of the Crusaders at Antioch was credited to a miracle, but even this miracle had a dark, suspicious side. A peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed he had a vision of the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced the side of Christ on the cross. He said it was buried under the floor of a local church. They dug and found a rusted piece of iron. While the leaders were skeptical, the ordinary soldiers were electrified. Their morale exploded, and they charged out of the city gates in a suicidal frenzy, defeating a much larger Turkish army. Was it a miracle, or was it a staged event by leaders who knew they would be eaten alive if they didn't find a way to make their men fight? The psychological power of faith was used here as a military weapon, turning starving, dying men into a force that did not fear death. From this point on, the crusade was no longer an army. It was a cult on the move, convinced that God was personally directing their every sword stroke. When the Crusaders finally saw the walls of Jerusalem in June 1099, they were a ghost of the force that had left Europe. Of the original 60,000 to 100,000 people, only about 12,000 remained. They were dehydrated, sun-blind, and standing in a landscape where the defenders had poisoned every well and cut down every tree for miles. The heat was so intense that men were reportedly licking the dew off stones and sticking their tongues into cracks in the ground to find moisture. They knew that an Egyptian relief army was only weeks away. They had one chance to take the city, or they would all die in the sand. This desperation led to a bizarre, barefoot procession around the city walls, where they blew trumpets and prayed, hoping the walls would fall like they did in the biblical story of Jericho. The Fatimid defenders on the walls laughed and mocked them, hanging crosses over the battlements and desecrating them in full view of the knights. But this mockery only fueled the Crusaders' rage. The final breakthrough at Jerusalem was a masterpiece of desperate engineering. 6 Christian ships had arrived at the port of Jaffa, carrying timber, nails, and skilled Genoese carpenters. The sailors, knowing they were blocked by an Egyptian fleet, burned their own ships so the wood wouldn't fall into enemy hands, and hauled the planks 40 miles through the desert to Jerusalem. Under the cover of darkness on July 14th, the Crusader leaders did something the defenders never expected. They dismantled their massive 5-story siege tower, the very one the defenders had been preparing for, and reassembled it at a completely different, less defended section of the wall in a single night. When the sun rose, the defenders realized they were guarding the wrong place. By noon on July 15th, Godfrey of Bouillon and his knights were over the battlements. The holy city was open, and the darkness that had been building for 3 years finally exploded. What happened next was not an ordinary medieval sack of a city. It was a systematic cleansing. The governor of the city, Iftikhar Adala, surrendered to the Knight Raymond of Toulouse in exchange for safe passage. He and his bodyguard were allowed to leave, making them almost the only people to survive. The rest were not so lucky. The Crusaders surged into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where thousands of civilians had gathered under a promise of protection. The knights slaughtered every single person inside. The Jewish community fled to their main synagogue, but the Crusaders simply locked the doors and set the building on fire. Listening to the screams of families burning alive while they sang hymns of praise outside, this is the dark truth that is often glossed over. The Crusaders were so blinded by their frenzy that they even killed the Eastern Christians of Jerusalem, the very people they had supposedly come to liberate, because they couldn't tell the difference between a local Christian and a Muslim by their appearance or language. They simply killed everyone. By the end of the week, the holiest city on earth was so full of corpses that the Crusaders had to force the few remaining survivors to pile the bodies in heaps, as tall as houses outside the gates to prevent a plague. The aftermath of this victory created a new kind of darkness, the era of European colonialism long before the term even existed. The knights didn't just fulfill their vows and go home. They stayed and carved up the Levant into 4 Crusader states. They built massive, imposing stone castles like the Crackday Chevaliers to dominate the local landscape and keep the population in check. They treated the local Muslims, Jews, and even the indigenous Christians as second-class citizens, forcing them to pay heavy taxes and banning them from positions of power. The crusade wasn't just a religious pilgrimage, it was a land grab. These states were effectively a narrow strip of European culture forced onto a Middle Eastern landscape, a project that was doomed to fail from the start because it was built on a foundation of extreme violence and exclusion. Why does this dark truth matter so much in the year 1998? Because the echoes of 1099 are still vibrating in our modern world? When modern Western leaders use the word crusade to describe a military mission or a political struggle, they might think of it as a metaphor for a good cause. But in the Middle East, that word is a trigger. It brings back the collective memory of the massacre at the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the cannibalism at Mara. For the Islamic world, the Crusades were eventually forgotten for centuries as a minor nuisance. But they were rediscovered during the age of 19th century European imperialism. They were recast as the original Western invasion, a narrative that is used today by radical groups to fuel modern conflicts. The wounds of the First Crusade were never truly allowed to heal. They were simply reopened every time a new conflict began between the East and the West. The First Crusade was an event of staggering human achievement and staggering human cruelty. It showed the world what happens when an entire society is told that their violence is not only permitted but sanctified by God. It transformed Europe, bringing back new knowledge in mathematics, medicine, and philosophy from a more sophisticated Islamic civilization, which eventually helped spark the Renaissance. But the price of that progress was a legacy of blood and a deep-seated distrust that still defines international relations today. The knights who walked into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre covered in blood believed they were the heroes of a divine story. But history, when viewed without the filter of myth, shows a much more complicated and darker reality. History is not just a collection of dates and battle maps. It is a mirror that shows us the best and worst of what we are capable of. The dark truth of the First Crusade is that it wasn't a war between good and evil. It was a collision of two worlds, fueled by the desperation of a dying feudal system and the dangerous power of religious fanaticism. As we look at the borders on our maps and the conflicts on our news screens today, we have to recognize that the ghosts of 1099 are still there, watching us. We have to ask ourselves, have we really moved past the logic of the crusade, or are we just using new words for the same old blood? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the shadows of our past. If you believe that understanding the ugly parts of history is the only way to build a better future, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Meditative History. The truth isn't always comfortable, but it is the only thing that can truly set us free.